Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into one of the most significant periods in world history, India's journey to independence.
Yeah, it's a complex story full of twists and turns. How did a nation as diverse as India, under the control of an empire, manage to forge a path towards self-rule? That's what we'll be exploring.
A nation as vast and diverse as India. It's hard to imagine the scale of the challenge. Where do we even begin to unpack this story?
Well, it all starts with the seeds of discontent sown in the late 19th century.
Okay, so we're talking about India under British rule. What was the situation like for the average Indian during that time?
Economic hardships were widespread, basic freedoms were restricted, and there was this pervasive sense of being treated as second-class citizens in their own lands.
Right, so you have all these ingredients for resentment, for a sense of injustice to brew. It's almost like the perfect breeding ground for a nationalist movement to take root.
Exactly. But it wasn't just one simple singular movement. It was more like a tapestry, woven with threads of diverse ideologies and approaches, each contributing to the grand narrative of India's struggle.
So where do we start unraveling this tapestry? Where did this nationalist fervor begin to solidify? What were some of the key events that pushed people towards demanding change?
Well, there were several catalysts, but I think one of the earliest and most significant was a series of events that exposed the stark reality of British control. Take the Arms Act of 1878, for example.
The Arms Act of 1878. Okay. Refresh my memory on that one.
Essentially, it disarmed the Indian population. They were prohibited from owning firearms without licenses, which were incredibly difficult to obtain.
Wow. Talk about a way to assert dominance and control. It's like saying, we don't trust you with the means to defend yourselves.
Exactly. It was a blatant power move. And then in the same year, you have the Vernacular Press Act.
Okay, the Vernacular Press Act, what was that all about?
Well, it allowed the government to censor publications in Indian languages.
So basically silencing any voices of dissent, controlling the narrative.
Precisely. These acts, along with events like the Ilbert Bill controversy, really sparked a wave of anger and a sense of injustice across India.
Right, the Ilbert Bill controversy.
Oh.
Now that rings a bell. Can you remind me of the specifics?
Basically, the bill proposed allowing Indian judges to preside over cases involving British subjects.
Ah, and I'm guessing that didn't go over well with the British community in India.
You guessed it. They saw it as a direct threat to their privileged status, a blatant example of how racial hierarchy was used to maintain power.
It sounds like these events were a wake-up call for many Indians, a realization that the British weren't going to simply hand over power or treat them as equals.
Absolutely. And it's in this context that the Indian National Congress emerges as a platform for articulating these grievances and demanding greater representation for Indians in the government and administration.
Okay, so the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885. This marks the beginning of a more organized national movement, right? But what was their approach? Were they advocating for complete independence from the start?
Not initially. Their initial approach was what we might call moderate.
Moderate in what sense? What were their demands and tactics?
Well, they believed in working within the existing system, using petitions, appeals, and constitutional means to push for reforms.
So a more gentlemanly approach,
Mhm.
appealing to the British sense of fairness and justice.
Yeah, you could say that. And this approach was very much shaped by the backgrounds of the early Congress leaders. Many were educated professionals, lawyers, intellectuals who had faith in the British system. They believed that reason and persuasion could prevail.
But it sounds like there were some who weren't so convinced about this reason and persuasion strategy. They're the radicals, right?
Exactly. As we move into the 20th century, a new generation of nationalist leaders emerges, figures like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Lala Lajpat Rai. They championed a more assertive approach to achieving Swaraj, which means self-rule.
What set these radicals apart from the moderates? Did they advocate for a complete break from the British?
They believed that true independence, not just concessions within the British Raj, was the only way forward. Tilak, for instance, famously proclaimed, "Freedom is my birthright, and I shall have it." His words resonated with a growing sense of frustration and impatience with the pace of change.
It's powerful stuff. It's a clear shift in tone, a more defiant stance. What were their strategies? Did they embrace more confrontational methods?
They did. They emphasized self-reliance, constructive work like building indigenous industries and educational institutions, and the mobilization of the masses. They critiqued the moderates' politics of prayers and argued for a more active and assertive struggle.
So it's like a shift from appealing to British goodwill to asserting Indian agency. taking control of their own destiny.
Exactly.
So you have this interesting dynamic within the Congress. Moderates advocating for a more gradual reformist approach, and radicals pushing for complete self-rule through more active resistance. How did these two camps coexist, and did one ultimately prevail?
It wasn't about one side winning, really. Both strands contributed significantly to the movement. Sometimes their approaches intertwined, sometimes they clashed. But a pivotal event in 1905 would test the strength of this burgeoning nationalist spirit.
Ooh, a pivotal event. I'm intrigued. What was it?
The Partition of Bengal.
Ah, yes, the Partition of Bengal. It's one of those historical turning points that resonates even today. Why did the British partition Bengal, and how did Indians react?
The official reason given was administrative convenience, essentially dividing the province for better governance. But for Indians, it was seen as a blatant attempt to divide and rule, to weaken the growing nationalist movement by separating Hindus and Muslims.
So a classic divide and conquer strategy,
Right.
and the Indians saw right through it.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't buying it, and this is where the Swadeshi movement comes in.
Okay, the Swadeshi movement. Tell me more about that.
The partition sparked outrage, and it really ignited this movement, this potent blend of economic and cultural nationalism.
What do you mean by economic and cultural nationalism?
It was about boycotting British goods, promoting Indian-made products, reviving indigenous industries, fostering a sense of national pride through language, education, and cultural revival.
So it went beyond just politics.
Yeah.
It tapped into a deeper sense of identity and self-reliance.
Precisely. Swadeshi wasn't just about rejecting British rule, it was about asserting Indian identity, reclaiming their economic and cultural space. Think of it as a statement. We are capable of governing ourselves, producing our own goods, shaping our own destiny.
Powerful stuff. It sounds like the stage is set for a truly mass movement to take hold. But something tells me this is just the beginning of India's long walk to freedom.
Oh, you're absolutely right. We've just laid the groundwork. The story of India's independence is a multifaceted saga with many more chapters to unfold.
This is fascinating stuff. I'm eager to hear more about how this movement evolves, especially with figures like Gandhi waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
But for now, let's take a pause and let our listeners digest this incredible start to India's fight for freedom.
As we move into the early 20th century, a global event would have a profound impact on India's struggle: World War I.
World War I. Interesting. I'm curious to know how a war fought on foreign soil could shape the course of India's independence movement.
It's a fascinating connection, actually. On the one hand, the war placed immense strain on India, both economically and socially, I mean.
In what ways?
Well, the British Raj ramped up taxation and recruitment, you see, which further burdened a population already grappling with hardship.
So a sense of resentment towards the British would have only intensified during this time?
Oh, absolutely. But on the other hand, the war also had some unintended consequences that actually fueled nationalist sentiments.
Okay, so it's a double-edged sword then. What were these unintended consequences?
Well, for instance, Indian soldiers were fighting alongside British troops, right?
Right.
And they were exposed to global events, you see, including like the rise of anti-colonial movements and the idea of self-determination.
So they're fighting for an empire that denies them basic freedoms back home. That must have been a jarring realization for many of them.
Exactly. They saw firsthand how other nations were fighting for their independence, and they began to question, well, why not India? You know?
Right. If they can do it, why not us?
Exactly. Moreover, the war created new economic opportunities for some Indians, leading to the growth of indigenous industries and a stronger sense of self-reliance.
So it's like World War I, in a way, planted the seeds for a more radicalized and assertive phase of the nationalist movement.
Precisely. The war experience, coupled with the continued frustrations with British policies, created, a fertile ground for new ideas and leaders to emerge. And it's into this charged atmosphere that Mahatma Gandhi arrives on the scene in 1915.
Gandhi. A name synonymous with India's independence. But he wasn't an instant leader, right? He had a very deliberate approach to building his influence.
That's right. Upon returning to India from South Africa, where he had already honed his skills in nonviolent resistance, Gandhi spent a year traveling extensively, immersing himself in the realities of life for ordinary Indians.
I've always been struck by that. He could have easily capitalized on his growing reputation and jumped right into the political fray. But he chose to listen and learn first. It's remarkable.
Yeah, it was a brilliant strategy. By connecting with people on the ground, understanding their grievances, experiencing their hardships firsthand, Gandhi built a foundation of trust and legitimacy, you see. That would later become his greatest strength.
And it was during this period that he got involved in those smaller, localized movements in Champaran, Kedah, and Ahmedabad.
Yes, these were crucial testing grounds for his philosophy of satyagraha, which he had developed in South Africa.
Right, satyagraha, meaning truth force.
Exactly. It was a form of nonviolent resistance that aimed to, well, appeal to the conscience of the oppressor and win them over through moral persuasion rather than brute force.
So it wasn't just about protests and boycotts. It was about a deeper moral and spiritual conviction.
Yes, exactly.
But how did these localized movements translate into a national struggle? Was there a specific turning point?
I'd say that turning point came in 1919 with the Rowlatt Act.
The Rowlatt Act. Okay, remind me about this one.
This act, passed by the British government, essentially gave them sweeping powers to arrest and detain anyone suspected of sedition without trial.
Wow, that sounds like a direct attack on basic civil liberties. How could they justify such a draconian law?
Well, they argued it was necessary to curb revolutionary activities and maintain order. But for Indians, it was seen as, a blatant attempt to stifle dissent and crush any opposition to British rule.
So the Rowlatt Act really ignited a wave of anger across India.
It did. And Gandhi saw this as the moment to launch his first nationwide satyagraha.
So this was the real beginning of Gandhi's leadership on the national stage. How did he mobilize the masses against such a powerful force?
He called for a nationwide hurdle, a complete shutdown of all activities, as a form of nonviolent protest.
A nationwide shutdown, that's bold.
It was, and the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life participated, from shopkeepers and students to lawyers and government officials.
Wow, a true show of unity and defiance.
Absolutely. The hurdle brought the country to a standstill, demonstrating the power of collective action. However, this wave of resistance was met with brutal repression by the British authorities, culminating in the horrific Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar.
Jallianwala Bagh. It's one of those events that sends chills down your spine. To think that British troops could open fire on a peaceful gathering of unarmed civilians, killing hundreds, it's unimaginable.
It was a turning point in the struggle for independence. The massacre shattered any remaining illusions about British benevolence, really, and it exposed the brutal reality of colonial rule.
The national outcry must have been deafening.
Oh, it was. And even moderate voices within the Congress were radicalized. Rabindranath Tagore, the renowned poet and philosopher, even renounced his knighthood in protest.
Right, a powerful symbolic act of defiance. It's clear that the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, coupled with the continued injustices of British rule, created a climate ripe for a more sustained and assertive movement. And it's into this turbulent landscape that the Khilafat movement emerges.
Yes, the Khilafat movement.
The Khilafat movement. I've heard the name, but I'm not entirely familiar with its goals and how it intertwined with India's struggle.
Well, the Khilafat movement was a pan-Islamic movement that arose in response to the British treatment of the Ottoman Caliphate after World War I. The Caliphate, based in Turkey, was considered the spiritual leader of the Muslim world, and Indian Muslims felt a strong sense of solidarity with their fellow believers.
So it was a movement rooted in religious solidarity then. But how did it become part of India's fight for independence?
Gandhi, you see, he saw a strategic opportunity to unite Hindus and Muslims under a common cause.
Uniting Hindus and Muslims. That was key.
It was. He recognized the potential of the Khilafat movement to galvanize Muslim support for the nationalist struggle, forging a united front against British rule. So he joined forces with Khilafat leaders like the Ali brothers, and together they called for a non-cooperation movement.
The non-cooperation movement.
Yeah.
This is where things really start to heat up, right?
They do. The non-cooperation movement was a watershed moment in India's journey to independence. It marks the beginning of a mass, organized movement that aimed to paralyze the British administration through non-violent means.
What were some of the key elements of this movement? How did they plan to non-cooperate?
It was a multi-pronged approach. Gandhi called for a boycott of British goods, institutions, and laws.
So a complete rejection of anything associated with the British.
That's right. Students left government schools and colleges. Lawyers boycotted British courts. People renounced their British titles and honors. And foreign cloth was burned in huge bonfires.
It sounds like they were hitting the British where it hurt. Their economy, their institutions, their symbols of authority. And all of this done without resorting to violence. Was this Gandhi's genius at work?
I think so, yes. Gandhi understood the power of symbolism and mass mobilization. By targeting these key areas, he aimed to disrupt the functioning of the British Raj and demonstrate the power of collective action. You see, it was a message to the British. We will no longer cooperate with a system that denies us our basic rights and freedoms.
It sounds like a truly national awakening, with people from all walks of life, Hindus and Muslims alike, united in their opposition to British rule. Was the movement successful in achieving its goals?
Well, it was a massive success in terms of mobilizing people and demonstrating the strength of popular sentiment against British rule. But the movement also faced its share of challenges and internal tensions, as you can imagine.
What kind of challenges? Were there disagreements about tactics or ideologies within this broad coalition?
Well, remember, this was a vast and diverse movement. And while Gandhi emphasized nonviolence, the interpretation of his message, well, wasn't always uniform. For example, some groups saw him as a almost messianic figure, who could solve all their problems.
Right, so Gandhi's message was open to interpretation, leading to different groups applying his ideas in ways that he may not have intended.
Exactly. And then, in 1922, a tragic incident occurred in the town of Chauri Chaura, where a group of protesters, angered by police brutality, set fire to a police station, killing 22 policemen.
Right, the Chauri Chaura incident, I've read about this. It was a devastating blow to Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence, wasn't it?
It was. Gandhi was deeply disturbed by the violence, and he felt that the movement was losing its commitment to nonviolence, its moral core.
So what did he do?
He took the drastic step of calling off the non-cooperation movement.
Wow, that must have been a controversial decision, after all that momentum, to suddenly pull back.
It was. Many within the Congress were critical of his decision, arguing that it would, demoralize the movement. But Gandhi was unwavering. He believed that any victory achieved through violence would be a hollow victory, one that would sow the seeds of future conflict.
So for Gandhi, it wasn't just about achieving independence. It was about achieving it through the right means, through nonviolent resistance, sticking to his principles, even when it was difficult.
Exactly. He felt it was crucial to reassert the principles of nonviolent resistance and ensure that the movement maintained its moral high ground.
This is where we see Gandhi's unwavering commitment to his principles, even if it meant making difficult and unpopular decisions. But where does the movement go from here? Does this mark the end of mass mobilization against the British?
Not at all. It's simply a turning point, a moment of reflection and recalibration. The story of India's journey to independence is far from over.
So we left off with Gandhi's decision to call off the non-cooperation movement after the violence at Chauri Chaura. It seemed like a setback at the time. But I imagine it also sparked some important debates within the movement itself, about the direction they should take.
Oh, absolutely. The suspension of the non-cooperation movement led to, a period of introspection and debate within the Congress. Some leaders argued for a shift in strategy, advocating for participation in elections and working within the system to achieve their goals.
So move back towards that moderate approach we talked about earlier.
Yeah, precisely. Leaders like Chittaranjan Das and Motilal Nehru, they formed the Swaraj Party. And they believed that, engaging in electoral politics could provide a platform to advance their agenda, gain influence within the government.
It sounds like a pragmatic approach. But I imagine Gandhi wasn't entirely on board with this idea. He seemed deeply committed to nonviolent resistance as the core principle of the movement.
You're right to point that out, yeah. Gandhi remained skeptical of electoral politics, believing that true independence could only be achieved through, self-reliance and constructive work, empowering people at the grassroots level.
So you have this fascinating dynamic playing out. A split within the Congress between those who saw value in engaging with the British system and those who remained committed to Gandhi's vision of Satyagraha. How did this play out in the years leading up to independence?
Well, it's important to remember that this wasn't a static situation. These different approaches often intertwined and evolved over time. Gandhi himself would later return to lead mass movements. But this period in the 1920s also saw the emergence of new political forces, you see. That added to the complexity of the landscape.
What kind of new forces? Are we talking about groups outside of the Congress?
Yes, the mid-1920s witnessed the formation of organizations like the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, a Hindu nationalist group, And the Communist Party of India, which drew inspiration from the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, these groups had very different visions for India's future, adding new layers to the already multifaceted nationalist movement.
So the fight for independence wasn't just about getting the British out. It was also about shaping the kind of India that would emerge after independence.
Yeah.
It sounds like a very dynamic and even contentious period.
Absolutely. And within this mix, you also have the rise of revolutionary nationalists, like Bhagat Singh, who believed that armed struggle was necessary to overthrow British rule.
Bhagat Singh. Now there's a name that's etched in history.
He and his comrades in the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, the HSRA, they carried out these daring acts of defiance, like the bombing of the Central Legislative Assembly in 1929, not to kill anyone, but to make the deaf hear, as he put it.
Bhagat Singh is such a compelling figure, a symbol of youthful idealism and sacrifice. His execution at the age of 23 is a stark reminder of the human cost of this struggle.
His story captures the passion and intensity of this era, but even amidst these diverse approaches, there were events that united Indians across ideological divides. In their opposition to British rule, the arrival of the Simon Commission in 1927 was one such event.
The Simon Commission. Why was it so controversial?
The Simon Commission was appointed by the British government, you see, to review the political situation in India and recommend constitutional reforms. But the problem was, the commission didn't include a single Indian member.
Wow, that's a huge oversight. It's almost as if they didn't trust Indians to have a say in their own future.
Exactly. The all-British composition of the commission was seen as a blatant insult, and it sparked widespread protests across India. Simon, go back! Became a rallying cry, uniting people from all walks of life in their opposition.
It sounds like the Simon Commission backfired spectacularly, further solidifying the demand for complete independence.
You're right. The Simon Commission fiasco made it clear that the British weren't serious about granting India, meaningful self-governance. And this fueled the call for Purna Swaraj, complete independence, which the Congress formally adopted as its goal in 1929 under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru.
So the stage is set for a new chapter in the struggle, one with complete independence as the ultimate goal. But the path to freedom was rarely straightforward. What were some of the key events that shaped this final push towards independence?
One event stands out as, a pivotal moment: the Salt March in 1930, led by Gandhi.
Ah, yes, the Salt March, one of the most iconic moments in India's fight for freedom. It even captured global attention. But why salt? It seems like an odd choice for a protest.
It was a stroke of genius on Gandhi's part, really. Salt, a basic necessity of life, was under the complete control of the British, who had imposed a salt tax, you see, that burdened the poorest Indians the most. By choosing salt as the focus of his protest, Gandhi ensured that the movement would resonate with the masses and expose the injustice of British rule in a way that everyone could understand.
So it wasn't just about salt. It was about using this everyday item to make a powerful statement about British control over the very fabric of Indian life.
Exactly. The Salt March began in March 1930, with Gandhi and a group of followers, walking over 240 miles, from his ashram in Sabarmati to the coastal town of Dandi, where they defied British law by making salt from seawater.
I can only imagine the impact of this march. This frail, elderly man walking for miles, followed by growing crowds of supporters, all defying a mighty empire with this simple act of making salt. It must have been a sight to behold.
It captured the imagination of people across India and resonated around the world. The Salt March triggered a wave of civil disobedience across the country, with people breaking the salt law, boycotting British goods, refusing to pay taxes. The British response was predictable: arrests, censorship, and brutality. But the movement had a profound impact, shaking the foundations of British rule and demonstrating the power of nonviolent resistance.
And it wasn't just men who participated in this movement, right? Women played a significant role as well.
Absolutely. The Salt March and the broader independence movement saw the active participation of women from all walks of life. They joined marches, picketed shops, led protests, even faced imprisonment. The movement provided a platform for women to step out of their traditional roles and contribute to the national struggle.
We have the inspiring story of Ambabai, a young widow from Karnataka who actively participated in the movement, describing those days as the happiest of her life. It speaks to how the movement empowered women and gave them a sense of purpose and agency.
Her story and the stories of countless other women highlights the transformative impact of the movement on women's lives and their role in shaping the future of India.
The Salt March was a defining moment, but the journey to independence wasn't over yet. World War II erupted in 1939, adding another layer of complexity to the situation. How did the war impact the independence movement?
The war created new challenges and opportunities. The Congress offered to support the British war effort, but only on the condition that India would be granted independence after the war. When the British refused, the Congress launched the Quit India movement in 1942, demanding immediate independence.
So the war became a catalyst for a more assertive push for independence. We'll help you fight this war, but only if you promise us freedom in return.
Exactly. The Quit India movement witnessed widespread protests and civil disobedience, but it was also met with harsh repression by the British. Many Congress leaders were imprisoned, and Gandhi himself was detained. However, the movement demonstrated the unwavering resolve of the Indian people to achieve freedom.
As the war drew to a close, the question of India's future became increasingly urgent. But with the growing divide between the Congress and the Muslim League, the path to independence was far from clear.
The Muslim League, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had intensified its demand for a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, arguing that the interests of Muslims could not be safeguarded in a Hindu-majority independent India.
So the final years leading up to independence were marked by intense negotiations, rising tensions, and the tragic reality of communal violence.
It was a turbulent period. The British, eager to leave India but also concerned about the potential for chaos, proposed a partition plan that would divide the country into two independent states, India and Pakistan. The plan was accepted by both the Congress and the Muslim League, but the process of partition was deeply flawed, leading to mass displacement, violence, and immense suffering.
It's a stark reminder that even the most momentous achievements often come with a heavy price.
Indeed. On August 15th, 1947, India finally achieved independence, marking the end of British rule. But the joy of freedom was intertwined with the tragedy of partition, leaving a legacy of pain and division that continues to shape the region to this day.
What a journey we've taken. From the early stirrings of discontent to mass movements led by Gandhi, the complexities of Hindu-Muslim relations, the rise of new political forces, and ultimately the bittersweet achievement of independence. This deep dive has offered a glimpse into one of the most pivotal periods in world history.
It's a story that reminds us of the power of human resilience, the complexities of identity and nationhood, and the enduring struggle for freedom and self-determination.
I'm left with a sense of awe at the scale of this movement, the sacrifices made, and the challenges overcome. It's a story that deserves to be remembered and studied, for it holds lessons that resonate far beyond the borders of India.
I couldn't agree more. It's a story that continues to inspire and challenge us, prompting us to reflect on the meaning of freedom, the importance of unity and diversity, and the enduring quest for a more just and equitable world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into India's journey to independence. We hope it's left you with a deeper understanding of this complex and fascinating period and a renewed appreciation for the sacrifices made by those who fought for freedom.